what's being done to standardize laws around the world, there actually are numerous different organizations trying to sit down and come up with some standardization as you go through. And you'll see different aspects, different challenges out there. The best thing to do is having a court, can a court sit down and intervene and enforce a contract? That really is that aspect of international business. If we can go down to Mexico and have a contract in the United States that's enforced by the Mexican government, that would be a fabulous help for us doing business in Mexico. And by the way, there's a lot of judges in Mexico that have followed that, and that's why Mexico has risen from being the #4 trading partner to the #1 trading partner in the United States. You'll see that whole aspect is when you start standardizing laws between countries through different kinds of trade agreements, it's going to really help the whole economy of not just the one country initiating it, but the countries that it's expanding to, and improve the overall trade relationships, because there's a level of trust that develops as you go through. We call this series of things Incoterms as you go through. These three different aspects of it, pay attention to them, because if you're going to engage in international business, you start having to learn the names of them. It's a matter of your eyeballs roll in the process. You need to hire an agent. My experience in the aspect of when I first dived into international trade myself, fast. What is fast? I had to go back and get my book out. I had to write things down. So CAF, cost, insurance, freight, port. Okay, yes. Okay, then by the way, once I get in port, I have to sit down and pay attention, because after 48 hours, I start paying daily rates for storage. Got to hire a company that transports from here to here. What about my insurance? That's right. I got to pick up the insurance from the other country over here, just in case the container falls off the ship or there's pirates that steal it. Yes, those things actually happen out there. So you have to know these three terminologies. And by the way, they're open to be test questions in a question. But if you're going to engage in the world of international business, this is part of the slang that we use as you go through. CAF, CFR, this is standard jargon in the world of international trade. If you're going to buy a good in another country, let's say it's China, you go through and have the good manufactured there. You want to have it inspected. You want to have it inspected 3 different times. You want to have it inspected, first of all, while they're manufacturing it, making certain they're using the materials that you specified in your agreement with them to make the materials over there. So you have an inspector come by during processing or during manufacturing as you're going through, making certain that it meets the criteria that you've set. Secondly, you want to have that same inspector, who's a third-party inspector, come back, and they're going to go back, they're going to inspect it to make certain they're crating up the material properly in the crates, that it's going to be safe in transit from China to the United States. Third, you want to make certain that the inspector returns to watch them loaded up onto the ship. That's a big deal, because you want your goods to leave the factory, and the inspector physically follows them to make certain it lands on the ship as they go through. Then you have to have insurance on the ship as it leaves China and comes across the ocean over to the United States. There is a possibility in super high seas, there have been container ships that have lost loads, and somebody's wonderful 10,000 shirts from Vietnam are now at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Yes, that really does happen over there, or the fish are wearing the shirts. Who knows what they're doing, especially the sharks. You can't trust a shark to not take your sweater and wear it for sport as you go through. So that being said, they come across the ocean in the process, and then once it hits our ports, what kind of fees, what kind of taxes? Are there tariffs at all? And then if there are, then you have to sit there and store it. How long do you got to store it? Well, after 48 hours, you start having storage charges. Well, what are the storage charges for this one versus this one? You have to pay. By the time you're all done, you got to make certain that you have a FAS, but primarily when it hits support, an CIF as you go through the process. So all the terminology comes in. We call them Incoterms as you go through. The competition law is another term for antitrust law. They're used a lot of times by the European Union. We call it the EU. And a lot of times the antitrust laws prevents large concentrations of power through price fixing, market sharing, and monopolies. Several US technology companies have gotten in serious trouble in the European Union because of the fact they dominate the entire market, where they have free reign here in the United States. In other countries, they sit down and look at that as abuse of power, because they're boxing out their own companies in their country that does a similar service to its citizens as they go through. And by the way, they have the right to protect their own economy and their own commerce in the process as well. US law includes a per se concept where we sit down and see the individual cases you go through. So there's a whole series of trade obstacles. They're political, financial, and legal obstacles There's packaging and language requirements. Sometimes you can package it well. Pretty much if it passes the US standard, it'll pass any standard in the world for packaging, except sometimes are you using the right kind of packaging? Is it environmentally safe for our country versus environmentally safe for their country? There's tariffs, quota, sometimes voluntary export restraints. All these things listed on this slide here are obstacles that you have to pay attention. And a lot of times the details, if you don't get the details right, you also can sit down and be in violation of numerous laws. And you get an excited bureaucrat coming through and they got a checkbook of all kinds of things, ways they can make money for their government by assessing fines against your company. You don't want to be there. Tort law, a lot of times it's an injury inflicted on another person, either intentionally or negligency as you go through and on a tort. So when that happens, you have a tort. So you want to sit down there and seek compensation for the damage it inflicted on you, either on a personal basis or as an individual, or as a corporation as you go through. There's product liability standards that are different in other countries as you go through. I was selling a book on an international market, and all of a sudden I got somebody sitting there saying, are you complying with the EU version for spamming people without their permission? Did you get my permission over here in France to sell your book over here? Because I didn't ask you to do that and I didn't approve it. Okay, I had to go back and look at the law. Sure enough, they were right. You have to get permission, which is different than the United States or Australia. You have to get permission to sell a book there. They have to sit down there and request your book. You can't automatically send an email, or they can sue you on a personal basis. That got kind of personal at that point as you go through. So it depends where you're selling your books, selling your wares from country to country as to what is a tort law and what you can be sued for as you go through. There's a lot of miscellaneous laws that you have to be aware of. Just because you don't know about the law doesn't mean that you have the right to violate it. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. It sounds good on a television show, but when you go to another country and it applies to you, it's not funny and it certainly is not entertaining. The legal penalties for not knowing the law can be very harsh, including even imprisonment sometimes. So the law of the home country plays no part in a foreigner's arrest that ever happens. It's only the law in the country that you're occupying as you go through. There's a debate centers what dolphin safe tuna label means on a different international sovereignty. You have the World Trade Organization, they weigh into it, but keep in mind, international trade rules are only subject if you want to comply with them. By the time you're all done, they don't have any power as you go through. In the US, we have a thing called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where us in our country, the United States, we have to sit down, we prohibit payments to foreign government officials. Bribes, pay attention, that's the thing. But other countries allow them to happen. For years, France did. They may still do that. And you write it off as a business expense. Take them out to lunch, and you sit down there and give them a gift as you go through. And that way it gets through. One time, we had a mission from a college. We were sending goods to another country. And I won't mention the other country, but they got held up in the airport, and it was pencils and notebooks. We didn't know any better. They were holding out for a bribe. We actually called the president of the country and said, excuse me, we're not going to pay anything more than what's required. Can you sit down there and send through our pencils and notebooks to the mountain tribe in this part of your country? So the president's office had an assistant call the chief of police at the airport, and they said, will you release that? These people are trying to help our own people, back it off. And so all of a sudden they got mysteriously released. Okay, those things happen, and it's not that unusual. Sometimes you end up paying $50 to let something that's worth just a few $100s slip through the system as you go through, because that's the culture that they have as you go through there. So a lot of different agreements happen. Here is a corruption perception as you go through. This is not a listing of the most corrupt countries, because Somalia and North Korea are not listed on here. These are just regular countries, but look at the evolution as to the corruption perception index for countries from 2002 to 2017. Now, by the way, you can hop on the internet, and of course, the internet, everything's true on the internet. No, it's not, but you'll see a lot of different ranking systems of corruption in different countries. So pay attention as to what you're going to involve. You'll see Switzerland really rises to the top on a regular basis for is it corrupt or not as you go through. The US doesn't always do so hot. We're looking at the bottom of the page as you go through, but these are perception over the practice as you go through. France, they don't have issues on bribes. They feel free to do that, write it off. So you have different aspects, and it depends where you're at as you go through the process. So you're seeing countries listed on here as to what is the perception of corruption as you go through. So a big thing is out there, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It's a response to worldwide scandals, and it sets high standards for boards in our country, and multiple countries abide by that, except at the end of the day, it's voluntary, except here in the United States. Pay attention to the terms. Here's the terms I want you to know as you go through. The Incoterms are FAS, CIF, and CFR. Know what those letters stand for. Part of this class is to be applied to the class, but I also want you to be comfortable if somebody says, yeah, I was going to pay some extra on my CFR. I'd like you to be able to know what that means. Antitrust law or competition law in the US, know what that's about. Trade obstacles, what kind of things we have to face out there, and tort law, that if somebody said something, they have a tort, how do they go about resolving that? And countries have it differently. And the whole different types of miscellaneous laws that may be interesting to the country that you're in, because if you don't pay attention, ignorance of the law is no excuse. Take care.